Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. At about this time of the year, the annual Australia-New Zealand Leaders Meeting is held. Australians rate our Prime Minister as the most trustworthy global leader, and last year 1.3 million Australians visited this country. But the Australian government seems to barely give us a thought. It partly funds 2 university-based think tanks to study its alliance with the United States, but it doesn't have even a single dedicated New Zealand Studies Centre. Is it time that New Zealand gave its big brother a kick in the shins? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
So what is the state of the ANZAC relationship? Is it as strong as ever, or are we drifting apart?
I think it's very strong. I think the current government inherited a very positive relationship between New Zealand and Australia. It's a multifaceted relationship. Economically, the closer economic relations was signed in 1983, probably the most comprehensive free trade agreement in the world. So the two economies are very closely linked. There's people-to-people ties, which you've alluded to. Australia is New Zealand's only formal ally. So particularly after ANZAC was effectively folded in the mid-80s for New Zealand was effectively expelled from that arrangement. We relied even more heavily on Australia in defence terms. So I think, if you look across the relationship, and it had markedly improved after Scott Morrison left. There was a lot of meeting of minds between Jacinda Ardern and Mr Albanese. And I don't think there's been a huge, if anything, the relationship's gathered more momentum with the election of a centre-right government in this country, led by Mr Luxon. And they've emphasised the foreign policy outlook of the current government puts a lot of emphasis on boosting relations with traditional allies. So there's been no downgrading of its relationship with Australia, quite the reverse, if anything. But there are occasionally irritations in the area of immigration. We're not happy about the way what are called 501s, people who were born in New Zealand but have spent much of their lives in Australia and may have committed offences which have led to their deportation. And there was a bit of a breakthrough on that front, but then Australia seems to have backtracked last year in June. It tightened up the regulations concerning that. So immigration is a bit of an irritation between the two countries, but and sometimes there are some foreign policy differences as well.
You mentioned all these connections, but what's the power dynamic there? Could we actually survive without Australia, or if we weren't in a good relationship with Australia, what would that be like?
I do think it's a two-way street. Yes, Australia is, if you like, the bigger partner. But at the moment, given the international environment, I think Australia and New Zealand are very glad of each other's friendship. Yes, we've got a population of 5.4 million people, and they are, I think, 27 million. But they are still, given their land space, quite small. And also we share so many challenges, for example, maritime security. Australia has, I think, the 3rd largest exclusive economic zone in the world. That's that tract of water, about 200 miles from this border of Australia. It's huge. And New Zealand, I think, is the 4th or 5th largest economic zone. So both of them have shared maritime interests. Both countries are hard pushed to adequately police these huge areas. So I think they need each other. Probably New Zealand needs Australia more than the reverse. I think that's quite true. But I think in the current international situation, in the last decade, both Australia and New Zealand have worried about what appears to be China's rise to superpower state, rise to second superpower, but also its apparent growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the Pacific Island nations region. So both countries are concerned about that. But you see, China's not the only threat to what could be called the international rules-based order, in which both Australia and New Zealand depends. You also have the Trump administration, which might be described as a revisionist state, because Trump is upending things which matter so much to Australia and New Zealand, like free trade, for example. Both countries have been the receiving end of tariffs. Also, Mr. Trump has threatened long-time allies of both Australia and New Zealand, Canada, for example. So I think, given the current international situation, both countries do value their close relationship very much.
You've mentioned a number of things happening on the international stage. What threatens the New Zealand-Australian relationship, and what things could bring it closer together?
At the moment, I think the things bringing them closer together still outweigh those that threaten it. As I said, there have been arguments between Australia and New Zealand over the treatment of 501s, and I think there's still a bit of a festering issue. Another thing that could happen with a change of government in Australia is a Peter Dutton-led government, a Liberal Party, a Conservative Party. That could cause problems, because I think Peter Dutton's view on a range of things are much closer to the Trump administration than the current government. Having said all that, I think while a change in government could cause irritations, I don't think it will affect the overall trajectory. I think there's less chance of a split now between New Zealand and Australia over foreign policy than there was, for example, when the Biden administration was in. Australia, for much of the post-war period, has been arguably one of America's closest allies. And there does seem to be a bit of a rethink going on in Canberra now. Anthony Albanese in particular has been quite outspoken by Australian standards in relation to America about the current relationship between the two. He described the imposition of tariffs as not the action of a close friend. And he meant by that they have a free trade agreement with the United States, and he probably felt quite justifiably that they would not be subject to tariffs, given how loyal Australia has been as an ally of the United States. So there is a bit of a rethink going on. Also, America First Trump policy doesn't really seem to take allies that seriously in the way that perhaps some previous presidents. America's always done its own thing ultimately, but I think previous administrations put more emphasis on the importance of alliances than this one does. And so I think Australia is in the process of reassessing its foreign policy. Another positive development that's occurred, seen through Australian eyes, has been New Zealand's decision to double its expenditure on defence. It's been a long-running concern. Every time I've been to Canberra over the last 2 decades, Australians often used to raise this issue, saying, isn't it a shame that New Zealand's not doing enough on the defence front? Well, the Albanese government is committed to spending 2.5%. We're committed over a period of time, I think it's 12 years, to spending 2%. So I think the governments are beginning to align more. And that's important because Australia, I think, has looked to the United States for its security. But I think with New Zealand doing more on the security front, they may be less inclined. They may be looking for more regional security arrangements. So I think it's an important development. I think there's still differences over how to handle China between New Zealand and Australia. But I think those differences have probably narrowed. Some of the differences have centred on relations with Pacific Island nations. But in recent years, I think two things have happened. Firstly, I think Australia, under the Albanese government, accepts that the number one security issue for Pacific Island nations is climate change. And that's been a position that New Zealand's long held. And secondly, I think New Zealand's moved a little bit towards Australia in recognising that Chinese assertiveness in the Pacific Island nation is perhaps greater than previous New Zealand governments had anticipated. We had the Ardern government condemning the Chinese agreement with the Solomon Islands, and now we have tension between New Zealand and the Cook Islands over the Chinese role there. The Cook Islands signing a comprehensive strategic agreement with China. We apparently were blindsided, and I think at the moment the situation is that New Zealand has paused funding for the Cook Islands. So, yeah, on balance, I think the pluses outweigh the minuses, very much so in the New Zealand-Australian relationship.
Is there anything that does need to change when the leaders do get together? Is there anything that Christopher Luxon needs to tell Anthony Albanese?
I don't think it's one telling the other. I would like them both to agree to become more vocal on articulating the interests of small and middle powers, which are qualitatively different from those of superpowers. Australia and New Zealand cannot rely on the United States to defend their interests. The United States has a veto in the Security Council. So it pays lip service, or it used to pay lip service to an international rules-based order. The Trump administration doesn't. It says it doesn't like multilateralism. It's lukewarm about the UN. But for Australia and New Zealand, these institutions are important. And Australia, like New Zealand, doesn't like the veto. So what I would like to see is New Zealand and Australia agreeing to play a leadership role in pushing for reform of the UN Security Council. Because at the moment, matters of war and peace rest on the shoulders of 5 countries, which is completely unacceptable to the 188 other members of the UN. So it would be useful for New Zealand and Australia to push in this area, or at least, I think, act as playmakers in bringing those other countries which are equally concerned about this. It seems to me in international politics, you don't get anything unless you ask for it. People are not, the United States is not going to say, oh, you're unhappy about the erosion of international law? Oh, we'll fix that for you. They're not going to do that. So I think there is real scope for a small power like New Zealand to collaborate with Australia, and it can both of them can depend on the support of Canada, as well as a number of European countries, in improving the international environment for small and middle powers. There is a precedent for this, and that's the Christchurch call, where after the shocking terrorist attack, which killed 51 Muslim New Zealanders, Jacinda Ardern cooperated with Emmanuel Macron, and together they instituted the Christchurch call, a measure which led to a sharp reduction in online extremism, a trend unfortunately which has been sadly reversed because many of the social media giants have changed hands and haven't honoured that commitment. But it shows you that small and middle powers can actually initiate international actions. 55 countries subsequently joined up and supported that initiative. And what's more, although Mr. Trump, during the first Trump administration, rejected the Christchurch call, the Biden administration joined it. So it is possible for smaller and middle powers to exert agency in the international arena and influence things. And I think it would be great if New Zealand and Australia, given their close relationship, use that closeness to wider international effect.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite.